Welcome to today's webinar titled Boarding Schools, Truths, Trauma, and Resilience, sponsored by Wisconsin First Nation and PBS Wisconsin Education. Today, we're going to talk about the history of Indian boarding schools in the United States. We have an amazing group of panelists that I'm honored to be working with here today that I'll have an opportunity to introduce shortly. In our role as educators, you're going to reach hundreds, if not thousands, of people. We want to provide you with information from the panelists who are leaders work here in Wisconsin. As a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and will be shared on PBS Wisconsin YouTube channel. As a participant of today's webinar, you will also receive a follow-up email containing more information from the webinar and contact details for any follow-up questions. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please type them into the chat and our panelists will try to respond to them if time remains at the end of our time together. I'd like to start us off with a quote here today before we jump into our time with our amazing panelists. It's a rare and sometimes life to participate in an idea whose time has come. Now we know forgiveness is our hope. It is our beginning of healing and well-being for Indigenous people. We now have a chance to break the cycle of missed opportunity and hopelessness our people have known. We know for sure that equal to love is that forgiveness. Our freedom lies in that. Don Cuellas, Mohican, 2009. And with that being said, folks, before we get into our topic at hand, I'd like to share some thoughts with you by hearing from each of our panelists before we begin our time. First, I'd like to turn it over to Kameminuki Palarabadu.
So we encourage you to take good care of yourself. Hopefully you're comfortably seated for this webinar, and perhaps you have a cup of tea or a water, maybe a blanket. Because of the genocidal nature of how colonization took place, we understand that historical and intergenerational trauma has been transmitted from our ancestors to us. Tears are a natural part of that process, and we encourage you to have tissues, perhaps a glass of water nearby. If there are tears, we drink from the water. To us, water precedes life and gives life. It is strong to give and take life that we honor it and give it our respect. And I'll pass it over to Dr. Jolene Bowman.
Anishik. Here's a picture. Is it the next slide? The General Pratt slide. So here's a picture of General Pratt and a quote from him that reads, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." To continue providing some historical context, we are going to play a video where you will have the opportunity to learn more and engage in an activity.
And before we jump into that, I'd like to have a few words with Barb Blacker-McKenzie.
Thank you. In order to clear the energy for everyone, I have started a smudge, and smudge essentially is a sage, and we burn it. And it's also known to be able to take a lot of microbes, bacteria and so on from the air. So in our virtual way, I'm sending you good blessings and good thoughts. With that, I would like to offer a meditation to everyone. Mona, this is your granddaughter, Huahingoinga. I'm small and weak and have so much to learn in the grand scheme of this universe. I ask for your grace, protection, and love to our ancestors and all the souls in your keeping, especially those who died at boarding or residential schools, those who survived the torture and torment that existed at boarding schools, our relatives who suffered the racism and oppressive experiences, and despite it all, managed to carry on our languages, cultures, values, attitudes, and beliefs through time. They have saved us from annihilation. Our relatives, Mother Earth, Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, and the many campfires we see at night. I also ask for your blessings and protection for our siblings, the slitherers, the many-legged, the four-legged, and two-legged, the plants, trees, rocks, and water, knowing we are all connected. I also ask for your protection for our clans and families, with special protection for our elders and children, for those in military service, protecting us all, for the prisoners of the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual kinds. And may all mourners be comforted during this time when they're feeling the heaviness of loss. It is with these things I humbly ask you to look upon those with favor. Aho. Back to you, David.
Thank you for sharing that, Barb. And so on to our next slide, I'd like to turn it over to our other panelists, Dr. Jolene Bowman.
So as stated earlier, to continue providing some historical context, we are going to play a video where you will have an opportunity to learn more and engage in an activity.
Before we start the activity, I would like to share the understanding that during this period of history, from 1870 through 1900, national attitudes and policy towards Indians largely focused on controlling Indians and forcing them to change. It was also a time when federal Indian agents and Christian missionaries exerted a great deal of control on reservation lands, and they were often corrupt, stealing the annuities and commodities that were intended for the Indian communities. This period of American history also saw the beginning of the boarding school era, a time in which American Indian children were forced to attend schools far from home and family, and where their traditional ways of life were totally banned and severe punishments were given for even speaking a tribal language. The group activity we are doing next will help give us a more personal understanding of what the boarding school experience was like. To clear our minds of the outside noise so that we can take in this experience, let's get comfortable by finding a position in your seat that feels right to you. Now let's do some relaxing exercises that starts with looking to your right, then left, now up, and then down, and now back to center. Together, if you feel comfortable, close your eyes while you find your own center by doing 3 deep breaths, breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. While I count you through this exercise. In through your nose, out through your mouth. In through your nose, out through your mouth. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Feel free to continue to keep your eyes closed and or open as we continue on through the exercise. Now that we are comfortable, relaxed, and our minds are clear and in a good place, let's find our happy thoughts. Those are the thoughts that make you feel happy and secure, like there's no worries in the world. Just breathe calmly as I talk you through an imaginary journey that asks you to think about what it would feel like if aliens came down to Earth and said they were going to take you away to another planet to be re-educated, shaped, and molded in the beliefs of the aliens. Imagine how it would feel like if you were forbidden to speak the language from Earth, and would have to learn the language that the aliens spoke, have to study the history and culture of the aliens, and have to practice the same religious beliefs and ways of the aliens that included eating, dressing, and grooming, just like the aliens. Okay, open your eyes if you close them. How do you think you would feel if this really happened to you? Now that we went through the imaginary journey exercise, it is time to look into the historical timeline, which is also available in a poster format, which I'll share with you later in this presentation. As you can see, the American Indian Boarding School is said to begin with the Indian Civilization Act Fund of March 3, 1819. It is not until 1875 when General Richard Pratt takes Apache prisoner of wars to Florida for a social experiment that Indian boarding schools start to take off. Here is a picture of General Pratt and a quote from him that reads, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with this sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race shall be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Then 53 years later, in 1928, the Merriam Report is published. The Merriam Report was a survey of the economic and social conditions of the American Indians during the 1920s. Data was collected by fieldwork for approximately 7 months, with 95 different jurisdictions that covered either reservations, Indian agencies, hospitals, schools, or communities where Indians had migrated. Particularly, all Western states with any considerable Indian population were included in the field work. The findings of this report expose the abuse, neglect, and failed American Indian education practices in U.S. boarding schools.
That particular video is available online, and we will send out the link. As Marcy has also put this in the chat for everyone here at the webinar. There are a few slides here that I wanted to take a moment to share. And this first one here is a before and after slide on the left side. You can actually see on the upper left, Richard Pratt is on the porch there with some newly arrived students. And on the bottom, you see the students as they were remade basically in those first few days at the school. The upper right is another picture of a before and after. And in the middle, on the right side, I just wanted to show how small the children were. Some children that were taken were as young as 3 years old. And then on the bottom right, I wanted to show some of my relatives who actually attended the Wittenberg School at, I think it was called Bethany Mission. Next. The photo that you see here was one that you just saw in Jolene's video. And this particular one, I wanted to talk a bit about the children who tried to run away from boarding schools in order to get back home. They were scared and lonely, and some had hundreds of miles to go. And a few were successful, but all too many were not, and they died on their way home, often from exposure. The boarding schools had a position called a catcher, and they were employed specifically to track and return students who had run away from the school. In some places, they would use manacles like the one you see in the picture in order to bring a child back. Note how tiny they are. Next. On this slide, there are several lessons, I think, from boarding school in terms of outcomes and dynamics. The first one was that the children that attended boarding school learned to don't talk, don't feel, don't tell, and don't trust. They felt blame, shame, guilt, and embarrassment for what they had experienced. And people who had gone to boarding school for any length of time were not easily accepted back home. Chronologically, they didn't follow in line with a lot of the ceremonies that had been traditionally done for thousands of years. And in this sense, in coming back home and having had their natural education interrupted, they weren't easily accepted back. So they should have somehow been able to know that. However, when you're that young, that's not necessarily how things work. Another thing that happened was that they were punished severely to speak English. Many were rendered mute from their first language due to the harsh punishments. Some had lost fingers, others were caged in basement jails. And you really have to ask yourself, what in the world were they thinking when a school has a place like a cemetery or cages and basements, and this is how they were punished. People who attended boarding school were not parented. So in that sense, when it was time for them to have families themselves, they didn't know how to parent. And over the years, these issues resulted in many first language native speakers dying without ever passing their native languages along to the next generation. And why is language such a big concern to us? It's because language contains our stories, our songs, our values, attitudes, beliefs, poetry, our worldviews. And many believe that our language was given to us by the Creator, and the words are sacred. Next. And to try and briefly explain why the orange shirts. Phyllis Jack Webstead was 6 years old when she was required to go to boarding school in Canada. And they're called residential schools up there. Her grandmother gifted her an orange shirt for her first day of school. She had to take a 2-hour bus ride to get to that residential school. And when she got there, she started to get scared because the building was taller than anything she'd ever seen. It seemed cold and unfriendly, as did the people who came out to meet the students. She asked her cousin how long they would be there, and her cousin said 300 sleeps. Now, to a 6-year-old, you think about that, that's a big number. It's a big number anyway, but when you're 6, it seems forever. And when they got off the bus, all the children were put in a single line, walked down a hallway, and down that hallway, they went into the rooms where they got their hair cut and were made to undress and take a shower for delousing. And Phyllis's clothes were taken away, including the orange shirt. And when she asked for it back, they told her she would never see it again. And what that made her feel in subsequent years, she was able to get home that next summer. She begged her grandmother not to make her go again. And she was lucky to have avoided that in future years. But her grandmother was potentially, jailed or fined for her not going. The color orange, well, as Phyllis said, the color orange has always reminded me of that and how my feelings didn't matter, how no one cared, and how I felt like I was worth nothing. All of us little children were crying and no one cared. And Orange Shirt Day was inspired by Phyllis's story and launched in 2013 in Canada to educate people about residential schools and to honor and remember the experiences and the loss of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children who were stolen from their families and placed in these schools. September 30th in particular represents the time of the year when this happened. And they were swept through the different villages and brought them home, brought them to the schools. So it's publicized as a Canada-wide annual Orange Shirt Day in order to invite others to join the conversation about the legacy of residential schools. The 30th September was chosen, as I said, because of that was when they swept the villages. And in the United States, many First Nations people are using Orange Shirt Day to raise awareness about boarding school experiences, which were very similar to the First Nations in Canada. And now back to David for our panel's formal introductions.
Before I'd like to introduce myself, folks, I'd like to introduce each of today's webinar panelists. You already heard from them sharing all different points. Afterwards, I'll have an opportunity to introduce myself as well. First, I'd like to introduce Barb Blackton-McKenzie. She is an enrolled member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. She's an educator, consultant, does amazing work across Wisconsin as well as throughout the US. Dr. Jolene Bowman, she's a citizen of the Stockbridge-Muncie community. She's also Director of Education and Career Services for the Stockbridge-Muncie Band Mohicans. We also have Kmeminuki Paula Rabidou. She is a member of the Menominee Nation, Turtle Clan, and she is the Culturally Sponsored Practices Coordinator at the Wisconsin RTI Center. These are our three featured panelists that will be having an opportunity to hear from today, talking about some of the work that they engage in with educators throughout our state. My name is Bagwagnigwid David J. O'Connor, and I'll be the facilitator for today's webinar. I am a member of the Batavia Spirit Chippewa, and I am the American Indian Studies Consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Construction. Today's discussion for our time together will be built around three open-ended discussion prompts. And I'm gonna have each of our panelists share in different orders at different time, but I'm gonna share the three different prompts as a heads up before we jump in. Our first prompt will be, tell us your journey or story, how you got into this work. That's prompt one. Prompt two is, how does the trauma of Indian boarding schools impact people and communities today? And our third prompt will be, what are suggestions for reconciliation and healing stemming from this policy? So we're gonna start off with prompt number one, and which is, tell us your journey or story on how you got into this work. And so for this, I'm asking our panelists to start in order with Barb Blackton-McKenzie, followed by Kmeminuki Paula Rabidou, as well as Dr. Jolene Bowman for this prompt. And so with that being said, I'm gonna turn it over to Barb.
Thanks, David. How did I get into this work? My aunt attended Toma Indian boarding school and she died there from tuberculosis. How this impacted me was that, you know, nobody wants to start off studying pain or man's inhumanity toward man. While growing up, I saw my dad exhibit signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. He was a code talker in World War II. I'm sure that he had plenty of experiences that contributed to that, but there were other experiences that couldn't well be defined under that particular category of, you know, wartime PTSD. And the triggers were such that I finally discovered what he passed along to me, not intentionally. Yet one of the defining qualities is called historical trauma. And it's the passing along of survival characteristics through genetics, epigenetics, and social transmission. The transmission is the giving of a task. The next generation must grapple with the trauma, and I was that next generation, finding ways of representing it and spare transmitting that hell back to the parents. And in doing so, that's certainly how I picked up the vocabulary. We did a lot of self-study. There was nothing really formal offered in that category in terms of classwork. And so that's partly why we bring this webinar to you today. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart defines historical trauma as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following the loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. At one point, I was asked when working for my tribe to do several different types of presentations and that kind of thing, because I was one of the few at that time that was college educated. And what I found was that there was actually a lot of bullying, and that was from other Ho-Chunk people. It's a term called lateral oppression. And when I started working for my tribe, there weren't a lot of us who really understood what this was. And there were things thrown at me like, why do you talk like that? Or you sound like a man, or that was disrespectful. And I was shocked because never have I wanted to be perceived as being disrespectful. So I apologized as best I could and made up for what I could. But these experiences certainly struck me. And years later, when I was researching a paper in my doctoral program, one of my papers included some historical information about boarding schools. It made me triangulate three things. One, that my aunt passed at Toma Indian Boarding School. Two, Nancy Laurie's book on Wisconsin Indians described how the boarding schools were often dirty and sometimes diseased places. And three, when I finally got over the shock of the lateral oppression, which took me years to figure out, it finally occurred to me, how was I supposed to learn these things about talking like a man or being disrespectful? And I eventually asked a couple of our clan mothers who was supposed to teach me these things. And they told me, your aunties. And I got very angry for that. Because how was I supposed to learn from them when one had died at boarding school in 1930, another died of a car accident, and the last died of a heart attack, probably based on historical trauma, when I was 5 years old? I had no opportunity to learn from them. Turn it over to Joe Bowman.
I came into my current position my current position as Director of Education and Career Services with a management background. So to elevate my academic voice and work, I received a second associate and bachelor's degree, but this time it was in early childhood elementary education from the College of Menominee Nation. Attaining these degrees gave me the skill set to not only manage, but also advocate in academia personally and professionally. While attending CMN, my interest in American Indian boarding schools grew in 2009 as a result of the boarding school research ignited from EDU 300, Foundations of American Education course. I chose to conduct my research on the Lutheran Indian Mission School in Red Springs because it was local and because it had connections to my tribe. During my research at our tribal Arvid E. Miller Historical Library and Museum, I found that despite the positive written history, there had to be more, because it was the written history was contrary to the history of American Indian boarding schools that I had previously read. This led me to go out into my community and talk to elders, which resulted in the oral stories starting to flow. I soon realized that the oral stories needed to be documented, so I wrote them down for publication and put them in a presentation and also in a poster. Anishi, Paula?
Poso. Well, my story is a little different in that I recall being in church, sitting in church with my mom as a high school student. And I had, sat there listening or trying to listen, and it just sort of resonated with me, like I'm sitting in a church, and why am I sitting in a church? And what did we do before? And we had to do something before there was churches. And why is this priest speaking to me in English? And there has to be, a reason why that is. And why am I thinking in English? Why am I not speaking in the language? And I was in high school taking my Menominee language, and I really connected to that as filling me up and making me feel whole and happy. And I really wanted to be able to just speak. And any of you have heard and learned Indigenous languages, you know that they can be very difficult to learn. They don't follow the same sequences as other language, formats may follow. And there's a lot of words that had to be created because we didn't have these things prior to contact. So it's very difficult. And I was frustrated because I just wanted to speak. And so when after church, I had asked my mom, and I said, why didn't you just speak to me when I was a child? I want to be able to talk just fluently and regularly in the language with my teacher and with people. And why didn't you teach me that? And she said, I didn't know that. And I said, sure you did. I've heard you say, no knocking to pame is butter. And I've heard you say poso, hello. I've heard you say wawan and thank you. I've heard you say things that are language. And she said, that's all I knew. And I said, well, how come you didn't know? And she said, boarding school. And I said, well, why didn't grandma just talk to you so that you could talk to me? And she said, you couldn't talk in boarding school. You were punished if you talked that in boarding school. And I knew she had gone to boarding school because I had heard about it my entire life. I had heard about, the bells and the prayers and the strictness and the marching and all of the things that she was experiencing in boarding school. And I recall her, oftentimes, it's time for dinner. And if we weren't there immediately, come when I call. If when we were in boarding school, if you didn't come when that bell rang, you were in trouble, So always relating back to when we were in boarding school, this is what would have happened. And so this just was always in my mind. And I just assumed that's the way it was for everyone. And that everyone went to boarding school because that's what I heard a lot in my life. And she said, I couldn't speak it. And I said, well, why didn't grandma talk to you? And she said, I will, you go back and ask your grandma. So I went to see my grandma and I asked her, why didn't she talk to my mom? Because I wanted to learn the language. And she said, it couldn't talk in boarding school. And she said, the last time I remember talking, I was maybe 6 or 7. And she said, I forgot. I would always forget and something would come out. And so the last time I remember speaking, I was made to kneel in the corner and the floors were wooden and we had skirts that were wool. And I remember having to pull my skirt up over my knees so that my knees were flat on the floor and so that I wouldn't have any cushion between my knees and the hard floor. And I had to kneel there for 6 or 7 hours and I couldn't talk and I couldn't drink and I couldn't eat and I couldn't go to the bathroom and I had to stay there. And if I would start to lean back on my feet to rest, I would get whipped across the back of my calves. My calves, so that I would kneel straight up again. And she said, and then I had to go to the bathroom, but I knew I couldn't talk or I would get in trouble. So I went to the bathroom in my pants. And then I got in trouble for going to the bathroom in my pants. And needless to say, this was heartbreaking to hear my grandmother telling me these things because I knew that they had gone to boarding school. And I was so frustrated and so angry and so hurt. And I was a teenager and I wanted my language really badly. And I just started to figure out, how could this happen? Why did this happen? What happened? Who did it happen to? And that my journey began. And I just began to look and search and research and read and find whatever I could, get my hands on whatever I could to teach me about boarding school. And so I went on to college, and obviously I didn't have anything I could learn as far as language goes. So I started to take as many classes as I could in American Indian anything. And I'm sorry. And they asked me to to start a program would be the first candidate for American Indian Studies at UW-Milwaukee. So that's what I did. And as I took these courses, I began to learn more and more about boarding schools and about the history and about historical trauma and what's happened to our peoples. So needless to say, the anger and the hurt that was welling up in me led me for healing. And so I began to attend ceremonies and seek out elders and do as much as I could spiritually to heal from the trauma that I was feeling within me through my parents and my grandparents. And as I learned more on the amount of time and the boarding school that existed on my reservation, you know, I understood that both of my parents had gone to boarding school, and all 4 of my grandparents and all 8 of my great grandparents, and that I was the first generation who had not experienced boarding school. And I knew that that trauma lived deep within me and I needed to do something about it. So I began to learn as much as I could and teach as much as I could about boarding school and historical trauma. So thank you for that, David.
Thank you to each of our panelists for sharing, using the prompt, tell us your journey or story of how you got on into this work. Just want to throw it back to each of the panelists if there's anything additional that you'd like to share for this webinar here today that you wanted to expand on, and or something that was shared by one of our other panelists that you wanted to build upon, or something else you'd like to share in general. So I'd like to open it up to either Barb, Kaminuki, and or Dr. Bowman, if you'd like to share anything else in additional to this prompt.
And I just want to add to the tail end of mine is that, you know, it's called historical trauma, and it makes you think like this was a long time ago. And some of the pictures we see are very old pictures, but I really want people to recognize how recent this is and how the children in your classrooms are affected by this inevitably, because you know that my children are in those classrooms and my relatives' children are in those classrooms, and that's just one generation removed from both of my parents being in boarding school, not being able to go home, having to live at that school in very sad situation. And although the way the boarding school was when my great grandparents were in was much harsher and much, you know, more painful and strict, and a lot of horrible things happening that weren't recorded. And then when my grandmother and grandfathers went, it may have been less, you know, terrible. And then when my mother went, you know, it may have not been as harsh, but regardless, it's never okay to take children from their families and to keep them away and raise them in these kinds of environments. So this wasn't a long time ago. This is recent. It's still in us now.
Thank you, Kaminuki. Anything additional from Barb or Dr. Bowman?
Just to add to that, the historical fact is that the last boarding school closed in the United States in 1970. In Canada, the last one closed in 1996.
And maybe that would be a good time for him to show the slide of the number of boarding schools in the States and how widespread this was. And, you know, I know people down the road from me, 7 miles away, aren't even aware that there was a boarding school here. But I'll pass it over to Dr. Bowman.
I guess I think what in part of my research when I started researching for this class was my mother worked for the Arvid E. Miller Library and Museum, and she sent me a video clip of the Thomas Indian School in New York. And it started off with the children singing "One Little, Two Little, Three Little Indians." And I was at my desk when I opened it up, and immediately the tears starting to flow. So this is very emotional. And it was very emotional for me because my grandmother taught me that song. But I always wondered what kind of trauma she must have went through to take that song and turn it around into a positive instead of a negative, because in that video it says they that song originated when they were counting dead Indians along the trail. So that's where that song originated. But my grandma taught it to me. We used to play a game with it, how fast we could count up to 10, how fast we could count down to 10, not realizing the pain that went behind it. And so that was, after seeing that video, I went by her and we talked a little bit about it. She already had dementia by this time, but we changed it around counting other things. And after that, we never ever sang that song. Alicia, thank you.
Thank you, Queen Manuki, Barb, and Dr. Bowman. Is there anything else that you'd like to add prior to we either to that slide that was just shown and or anything else from the prompt?
I just want to add, for our educators, the pedagogy, and this is what I think really shows the striking difference between what happened in, your average school system and mainstream society versus the Indian boarding schools. And the pedagogy traditionally for tribes was such that you observed it, you tried it, you practiced it, and you mastered it. And it didn't matter if it was something as quick as snapping your fingers or if it was something extended like becoming a master artist in basketry. It was always that constant, you observe it, you try it, you practice it, and you eventually master it. And the practicing, like I said, could take years. In contrast to that, the pedagogy within boarding schools just wasn't was hardly in existence. The types of things that they would do were craft working and manual labor types of things, and domestic things for girls, ironing, sewing, those types of things. So in that sense, it wasn't really addressing the whole person, and it certainly wasn't the tried and true method of what Indigenous people did. And the punishment was such a change. It was brutally different. Just needed to say that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Barb. And just for folks, I know a couple of folks did ask in the chat. Once again, this webinar is being recorded. It will be put on the PBS YouTube channel. In addition, the slides that we are sharing throughout our time here today will also be shared out afterwards via email as well. And with that being said, looking forward ahead or to our second prompt. How does the trauma of Indian boarding schools impact people and communities today? And so for this order of our panelists, I'd like to ask Kami Manuki to start us off, followed by Dr. Bowman, and last followed by Barb.
Thank you, David. So, I shared the story of my grandmother, and in the end, when she was made to kneel there for all those hours, she said that she had, that was the last time she remembered speaking. And she said after that, she thinks she blocked it from her memory because of the pain of that. She shut off the part of her that could speak Menominee. And she said she didn't speak again. And that was heartbreaking because I also know, I said, well, then how did my mom know these words, And she said, well, some of the boys were more rebellious, and they would do things to try to keep the language or keep talking. And she said, after the lights went out, my grandpa told her that sometimes they would sneak out the window and go into the woods and talk to each other in Menominee so they wouldn't forget. And he said, my grandma said, you could have gotten in huge trouble. You could have had your food kept from you. You could have been sent to the hole, punishment. The hole was like the hole in prison, in jail, where you would go to a place and be locked in there, dark, no food and water, etc., just like in prison. And he said, we said they can take us from our mothers, but they can't take this away. And so they were so strong in trying to keep that they would speak to each other. And so my grandfather kept some of the words and kept some of the language, and he would try to give it to my mom and his kids, at the table, and say, pass me the no nakanipame, I mean butter, and see if my mom could catch that and be able to remember those words. And so she learned some of those things, and she said, but she would get angry at him, and she would like hit him and say, don't speak that, don't tell them that. I don't want my babies to learn that. I don't want them to get in trouble. You know what will happen when they take them to that school, and if they speak those things. So she was protecting her children by not teaching them the language. And so the loss of language was huge for our people, and many peoples, many tribes across the country. So the loss of language was huge. The loss, the taking away of all of the culture and spirituality was huge. They took a lot of tools away from children. As people, we have our toolboxes that help us to overcome hardships, to heal from things. And so we reach into that toolbox of spirituality, or things that we can do, or family, or supports that help us get through difficult things. And so these were children who had their toolboxes emptied, and their culture tried to be stripped from them. So they had nothing to lean on to help them get through these difficult times. So, that pain and that loss of being able to heal from trauma that they were experiencing through the culture. So a lot of culture loss, a lot of language loss, and then ultimately, the study of epigenetics has come, which, is the study of how the environment can cause changes in DNA that affect the way our genes work. And so it doesn't change the underlying sequence of our genes, but it changes how our genes release instructions, like building future capacity for healing, for health, for skills, for resilience. And so our genes are altered through this trauma, and that's passed down through birth to your children, and as you carry children, and it's in their DNA. And so epigenetics are proven to be an effect within Indigenous people because of historical trauma through boarding schools. So we have this in our DNA, and it's a part of our every being. It's a part of my children. And as my healing occurs, I try to help to prevent that passing down of trauma through our genes. So culture, language, and epigenetics are ways that this boarding school impacts our people in our communities today.
Thank you for sharing that, Kiminuki. I'd like to extend it over to Dr. Bowman.
Thank you. I think my response is basically a summary of the research and just with a discussion. But I found that children responded differently to the abuse. For some who could not cope with the abuse of being away from their home and culture, responded by using personal and social destruction as a coping mechanism. Others survived the trauma by obeying the rules of assimilation with little to no resistance. Obeying for some was not a choice, but another coping mechanism for survival. In other words, if you can't beat them, join them. Obeying the rules meant that the children had to forget the only traditions and culture they knew, because it was different than the mainstream culture of Christian education taught in the 1900s. History tells us that children were repeatedly told not to practice or follow the only tradition and culture they knew because it was evil. Contrary to this belief, and through revitalization efforts, Native people nurtured generations with the same traditions and culture, and they survived evil actions of others, such as multiple removals, Indian wars, introduction of disease, and so forth, which today we call resilience. The children who obeyed the rules against the will or conscious recognition to survive took on a great burden by internalizing the pain. As others were led to trauma, many American Indian people rose above their painful experience only to remember the good. Anishu.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman. And extend to our last panelist, Barb.
Thank you. If you can think of any stereotype that's ever been applied to Native Americans, the drinking, drugging, just really anything negative that's been applied stereotypically, that's shown up because of, in part, boarding schools. And yes, we have a lot of social problems within our communities. And that's part of what it is to attempt to try and heal together, as well as to try and bond, not only through the trauma, but mainly through the resilience. You know, as Paula was talking about, attending ceremonies and you know, being able to speak the language. Those are, you know, positive, healthy coping skills for us to be able to revitalize our culture, despite having this interruption and the decimation of our cultures take place. You know, other types of statistics, as you will, that we've seen are high levels of incarceration, tensions with law enforcement. It turns out that, you know, we've heard of Black Lives Matter. Native Lives Matter is actually a higher disproportionality when encountering police and being shot for it. Jurisdiction and sovereignty are constant challenges for us. The trauma, as we're talking about, is another. Distrust of healthcare and social service systems is part of it. And then on top of it, you know, something that Dr. Bowman was just talking about is the fact that, you know, we were forced to attend these schools and basically Americanize. Well, the big difference for us was that we didn't choose this. You know, immigrants came to the United States and they wanted to, you know, assimilate and acculturate into the mainstream society. This was put upon us. It wasn't, you know, something that we chose to do. And so with that, it was just all that much more oppression that was taking place. As far as the general community, you know, one of the, something that's not new and you've probably thought about yourselves, in context with this is, the idea that, you know, my teachers never told me this. They lied to me. They didn't know any better either. But, you know, it felt like I didn't get what I was supposed to as a student. That goes for everybody. When this is not taught, we're basically erased as a people, but even worse yet, you're intruding upon the diversity, the beautiful diversity that we have in our communities. You know, so there's been a lot of, you know, self-knowledge built, reconciling knowledge, you know, thinking about, you know, what else happened that was put upon a group of people as opposed to, you know, selecting that as a way to better integrate into their communities. Another one is trying to figure out age appropriate lessons in the classroom. And this is something we'll talk about in our next prompt. But what's important is that my generation and my children feel all the feels. So this trauma transmission quits. And it's really, really hard. I can't even begin to explain how difficult that is when, you know, talking about like Paula's story and what her great-grandparents and her grandparents and her parents experienced, and having so many levels, so many generations go through something like that. And that was the crux of it. And Paula's, one example of that. I'm, every single person now that's living and is identifying as Native American, American Indian, Indigenous, First Nations person has been touched by boarding schools somewhere in their family. The population at the time of when boarding schools were popular was such that there were only about 250,000 Native Americans left within the United States, and 60,000 of them were in boarding schools. So it's a massive percentage of people who were impacted by these systems and institutions. So before engaging this information in the classroom, you might want to consider adding some mindfulness activities that would help balance out the social emotional learning along with the facts that have to be done. A worry basket, breathing, an exercise, what's good in talking about this, what's hard in talking about this topic. And basically that's a partnership type of an exercise where, like say I was challenging David with this and we were partners in the classroom, then I would just keep repeating for 30 seconds as the teacher measured this. What's good in talking about, boarding schools, and he would answer, and then I would ask him again, what's good in talking about boarding schools? And keep asking that for 30 seconds as he gives me that answer. And then the flip side of it, what's hard in talking about boarding schools? And let's get those listed as well. And so he's responding to that. Of course, then we flip, change turns where he's asking me those same types of questions. But that gives us the opportunity to get some of this information down in terms of how it's making us feel and what the status of the class is doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Barb. Just want to add just a comment that was made by one of the individuals who was participating in today's webinar in the chat box, indicated that despite Act 31, for context for folks what that is a state requirement that all school districts as well as pre-service education programs must provide instruction on Wisconsin American history, culture, and tribal sovereignty. It's indicated, this individual indicated that many students in grades K through 16, Wisconsin still don't know much about any boarding schools and how recently they occurred, similar to what we just talked about from Barb early on. Beyond making sure that students learn about this history, I think it's important that we name what happened, cultural genocide and erasure, then maybe we can move towards reparations. And so with that being said, I'd like to throw it out to our panelists if they'd like to share out anything further on this second prompt regarding how does the trauma of ending boarding schools impact people and communities today. Anything further each of you as panelists would like to share?
I think it's important to remind educators that are on that are watching this webinar that there are resources that are connected to how to introduce this into your classroom. The National American Indian Boarding School Healing Coalition webpage has a list of resources of books to use depending on age level, on how to talk about and what books to introduce into the classroom. So it's important that you as change agents, now that you are aware, that you take this information and do something with it to make change for the next generations, because we all are responsible. Anishuk, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman. Kiminuki or Barb, anything further you want to share for this prompt?
I just wanted to add, that we, as Barb was saying, in my experience, as opposed to other people's experiences, to recognize the difference in the boarding schools as well. Some the dates when they closed were given, and they varied across the boarding school and across the state and across the border from Canada to the US, and closing much later in Canada. And so when people may be affected by this is all different, right? So some people it's our parents, some people it's our grandparents, some people it's our great grandparents. And so, you know, my great nieces and nephews in school now would be saying their great grandma was in boarding school, which makes it seem like forever ago, right? But that's really my mother who just passed this year. And so these people are walking around among us still. And in some places, maybe they've closed a lot longer ago, and it might be somebody's further distant relative, but it doesn't make it any less traumatizing, doesn't make it any better or worse because of the member of the family who it was or how long ago it was, because through epigenetics, that's in us. And until these things are healed, it's going to continue to pass down through generations, right? And I'll get to more of that in our next prompt. But I just wanted to help people keep in mind the variation in the boarding schools. You saw the map, but did you look at Wisconsin and the number of them in Wisconsin alone? I know some states may not have had them, but when you're talking about our state and you're educating in our state, you should be aware of what the boarding schools were here in our state and how long ago they closed, because our children are in your classrooms and you need to understand what they're carrying with them. And you need to understand, you know, how that trauma is inside them, and maybe even understand where it began for them, you know, who was carrying that, you know, and that's actually an activity that we talk about when we try to do healing with our children on the reservation, is recognizing who was in boarding school in your family, because every one of us on my reservation are affected by this. Every one of us has stories of people who were in the boarding school. And so for our children to heal and understand that as well, but for those people who are teaching our children to understand that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, McKim. Anything further, Barb? You'd like to add on or share?
Well, I'm rearing to go for the next prompt because that's where it's all going to just come out.
Thank you to each of you for sharing out on both the first prompt and second prompt. And for our third and final prompt, we have already been talking about it in some different areas. Just want to ask you as panelists, what are some suggestions for reconciliation and healing from this policy? And so with that being said, for this prompt, I'd like to start off with Dr. Bowman, followed by Barb, and followed by Miminuki.
Well, even though the devastating trauma from the boarding school experience continues to impact many American Indian lives today, the good news is that we can heal from it. It is vital for American Indian people to heal and move forward positively for ourselves, for those we love, for those we are yet to love, and vote for those who were impacted but unable to heal before crossing over to the spiritual world. Healing begins with telling our stories and having the ability to forgive, which are the roots that feed our soul and human beingness. If we do not speak our stories and have forgiveness in our hearts, then we could be opening ourselves as conduits for this trauma to continue into the next generation, which then becomes what is termed as intergenerational trauma, which the panelists have discussed in previous prompts. We can help stop the trauma cycle in our own environment by creating a safe space that is free of historical trauma. This begins with surrounding ourselves with positive resources where we are free to learn, grow, and explore. To work through trauma or someone's story begins with love and all the fixings that go with it, to gain one's trust and to build an unwavering relationship. Getting to know others on a deeper level will help craft relationships that are free of distractions and open to endless opportunities. And I leave you with this: modeling civility at the core of each day and expecting nothing else is a good start. Because remember, there is no such thing as a bad person, only a bad memory. Anishik, Bart?
Thank you. When it comes to truth and reconciliation, we're in the midst of a political fight right now at the federal level. And the boardingschoolhealing.org site has some really wonderful resources, including a toolkit where you and or your students can participate in the weeks of action. And they are going week by week. It's kind of a countdown of 7 weeks of action for 7 generations. With those weeks, you're asked to write letters and contact your representatives at the federal level to make sure that the federal government will basically open up the information. There's very little information I have about my aunt. I just know that she attended the school and that she died in 1930. Anything else in terms of her school records and those types of things have, I'm not sure where they are, even despite searching the BIA archives where the school's information is held. So this bill that they're trying to pass would help open up those avenues of trying to figure out more information about our ancestors, and also starting a truth and reconciliation here in the United States. If you do an internet search, you will find that there are lots of resources, and that, oftentimes they're Canadian. Well, they've gone through this process where they actually have a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and they already have done this work by taking testimony from survivors and descendants. And these are all pieces that are yet to take place in the United States, and we really need everyone's help to be able to get this bill passed. So that's one thing. And just to even raise the awareness is important. So the activity suggestions I would put out there would include wearing the orange shirts on the 30th, having the kids decorate some, have students learn about boarding in residential schools, tell others what they've learned through seminars and summits and, different opportunities that they have to share information in school. Hold an assembly. If you can't do this face-to-face, then do it online. Have door greeters ask students to sign a pledge that they're committed to never forgetting that this happened, to always remember that this happened, and it's not a good part of history. And the whole reason that we learn about it is to make sure we don't repeat it. Another would be to hold a drum circle. Even if you have no Native students in your school district, it's still important to share this information. And there are opportunities online to be able to, enjoy some Native American music, some exposure, and so it's with those that I encourage you to take a look for the authenticity, look for the genuine article. Those that are produced by tribes are, more likely to be authentic. So there's those. You could paint rocks in remembrance, and you could even have local elders speak, but I would suggest taking definite care with that particular suggestion, in that it can be traumatizing, re-traumatizing for the elder and or the students to vicariously experience that. Another one would be to read a book. One of the opportunities available through school districts right now, and this is again from Canada, is the orange shirt package. And they have developmentally appropriate books for, kindergarten and your middle schoolers and your high schoolers. And that pack is available at Amazon. And I would encourage your district to take a look at that, because it also it not only tells Phyllis Websted's story, but it also has discussion guidelines and ideas for other exercises that can help build that social emotional learning in all of the students. Another one would be to create awareness, like making posters and informing others of Orange Shirt Day. And, again, going to boarding school healing and looking at the Truth Commission and what they're looking for with that particular activity in terms of our activism. And then also, if you do nothing else, please take a moment and think about how we can support Indigenous people across North America now. And then ask the question, how will you take action to make sure that those items happen? Thanks.
Thank you, Barb. I'd like to turn over to Kim Minuki.
So I would say, number one, echoing what the individual said in the chat, right, was to teach the history, name what happened, cultural genocide, recognize it, admit it, giving that recognition to us as Indigenous people, to have our government, our people recognize and say this happened is a part of the first step for healing, right? Is acknowledging this happened and providing that history for people to learn about it. So I would say that is huge. Teach about it, talk about it, help children understand it, students understand it. Barb and Dr. Bowman have given excellent resources, and there are more and more becoming available, right? There are books at all levels. Shishiatko, right, is a very young child's book to help kids understand what a child was experiencing going and leaving to go to boarding school. Indian Horse, right, is a book for older children, and actually a movie that you can watch, right? There's even a movie made in the 70s, Where the Spirit Lives, is about a Canadian boarding schools children's, these are drama movies that you can watch, not just, documentaries are as good as well. But documentaries can be difficult because they can be very hard to watch and very re-traumatizing, and, facts and truths about what happened, learning the statistics and the data. One of the data points I had learned from Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart is that 50% of the children didn't make it out of boarding schools. The amount of difficult experiences that took place in boarding schools is really sickening to think about what happened to children in these schools. And it's a well-kept secret, and it can't be a secret. People have to know what happened, the amount of damage, the amount of trauma, the layers and layers of pain that children experienced. When you think about the pain of one traumatic experience that you might have had, you've had to go through healing for that. You've had to maybe have some psychiatric therapy for that. You maybe have to have some medication for that. Now think about these children for 3 to 4 generations who went through this trauma after trauma after trauma, from sometimes 3 years old to sometimes 21 years old. Just continual trauma for generations. The amount and layers of pain and healing that needs to occur to undo that. An elder told me it took 3 to 4 generations of our children. It's going to take us 3 to 4 generations to heal from that. And so that healing that we need to participate in also has to be involve reclamation, right? Taking back what was taken from us. I talked about that toolbox that was emptied from all of the past 3 generations of my family. That toolbox that was empty, I've had to spend my life refilling that toolbox, and continually I've been on a 35-year healing journey from 3 generations of boarding school trauma. And I've had to reclaim a great deal of what was taken, that my mother was not able to teach me, that I had to seek out and look for. So we have to provide that now for our communities, for our children, and that will help to heal. But we also provide those opportunities through schools, right? To have them participate in cultural activities, provide those opportunities in schools, provide that that visibility in schools so that our children can heal, because our children are hurting and they don't even know why. That this boarding school trauma is within us. And so refilling them up with stuff that helps them to heal is key for us as people to heal. And then understanding again what our children went through, or what our ancestors went through, and what our children are carrying as a result of that is huge. So that reclamation and that recognition and that healing all has to come together in different ways. Attending things like this, providing things like this for your staff to learn from, so that they can understand better, so that they can provide opportunities, so that they can, hold hands and help with healing, and help be an advocate and being an ally and a co-conspirator for this truth and reconciliation for Indigenous people. The traumas that existed at the video that Dr. Bowman was referring to, the Thomas Indian School is a noted school to show some of the worst things that have occurred with children over generations. The sexual molestation, the things that took place, with the amount of pain and trauma that took place, is key to helping us, to helping you understand and helping us heal. So recognition and reclamation and teaching, that all goes hand in hand. I'll pass it over to Dr. Bowman.
So just opening up to the group. I know each of you had the opportunity to share on this prompt. Anything additional that you would like to share, either that was shared by one of the other panelists or things that you just like to further share on?
I guess I'd like to say that, in order to make a connection with your students, it's really important to stay vulnerable. It's a risk that we have to take as educators if we want to experience that connection. Brene Brown mentioned that, she said, staying vulnerable is a risk that we have to take if we want to experience connection. If we don't connect, then how are we supposed to engage in all the other learning we expect children to do? And even if this is your first time through this information, I encourage you to lean into the discomfort, lean into that, and nobody can fault you for trying your very best to do the right thing. And so I really encourage you that, yes, we need you as an ally. The decimation that has taken place has been so horrendous that there's hardly words for it. Some people are starting to actually recognize that this is one of the elements that has caused Native American or American Indian genocide. And so it's really important that this information get out there so that it doesn't happen again, ever.
Thank you, Barb. Dr. Bowman or Kiminuki, any final thoughts on this prompt?
I just would like to say thank you, educators, for joining us today. And I don't think we're over yet, but the first step is making self-awareness, and that's exactly what you're doing by attending this webinar, is becoming more aware, because the more we know, the better we can be. So
Thank you, Dr. Bowman. Kremanuki.
I was just trying to check the Q&A to see if there were any questions or if there were any in the chat that individuals had, but this is a first step to healing, also as you attending and your interest and concern for this topic and for participation in Orange Shirt Day. And all of these awarenesses help to create a better community for all, you know, as Indigenous people recognize the desire for educators to learn and to teach about this is a step towards healing. So I thank you for attending as well. And I'm not sure if somebody has a question in the Q&A, David.
I will share the questions out for the panelists. But just real quick, folks, just as a reminder, early on that we just talked about the reason for this webinar being ahead of Orange Shirt Day, which is taking place this Friday, September 30th, was an opportunity to give resources and tools to you as educators to use in your classrooms and or other programming that you may be doing in regards to recognizing Orange Shirt Day, as well as other things regarding Indian boarding schools and other things that each of our panelists has talked about as well. And so with that being said, folks, I'm going to go to the chat and see what question, if you have any questions that we'd like to ask the group at large, I would definitely encourage you to ask. I do see a couple quick ones. One asks that what future learning events are coming if you'd like to recommend this kind of learning about Indigenous people to others. I'll definitely share with you one upcoming one in a moment, as well as some additional ones. But is there anything from the panel that you are engaged in that you'd like to encourage folks like individuals who are attending today's webinar to be a part of? You know, kind of trainings, programs, professional development opportunities, any of them you are engaged in.
I just want to address the quote, the comment in the chat about and teaching fourth grade class and sometimes worrying about the emotional maturity of the students learning this. And but you know, one of the responses that I've heard from an elder is, you know, our children in fourth grade experienced this, so other children in fourth grade should be able to hear about what they experienced. And there are, as Barb and Dr. Bowman have shared, many resources to help to share this information.
Barbara, Dr. Bowman?
I was just going to add in there that the National Holocaust Museum, although focused on the Jewish and Nazi Holocaust, has resources and some suggestions in terms of what it's good to talk about. And their recommendation is that, you know, the empathy in being able to connect individual stories or testimonies with the empathy and the social emotional learning that's hoped for are typically built like fifth to sixth grade on. And so, you know, the lower grades, you know, that birth to fourth to fifth grade is, you know, prime time to cover good books, you know, that talk about diversity and getting along and reconciling conflict and being able to self-advocate and all of these different pieces that have all come into play as, you know, as we seek social justice. Then, you know, those are all pieces that we need as a foundation for our students to be able to better learn this information as they go through those later grades. So I encourage you to do that. And as far as the question in the chat with regards to the new chancellor, yes, she has contacted Ho-Chunk leadership. And so, you know, in that sense, she's working on it in many different respects. And with the flag raising, that was a really hopeful day for all of us. And my hope is that, yes, as a land grant university, that we see a lot more change with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's going to be an awesome time to be able to see that history take place.
Anything else from our
just wanna-
panelists? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, I too want to thank all of you for attending the webinar today, and I'm just grateful that you're willing to listen and to learn and to be open to these new experiences. I know it's hard, but we appreciate it.
Thank you, Barb. Anything else from our panelists? As I know we're getting to the tail end of our time for our webinar for today. All right, with that being said, I'd like to go back to one of the slides regarding staying in touch. I definitely want to first and foremost give a big thanks to each of our panelists, not only for opening up their minds, but their hearts as well as their souls in terms of this work. Just want to say miigwech to each of you for being here today, and I was very honored to be in this space as a facilitator with each of you as panelists, both as friends as well as colleagues. I also like to send a big thank you to the sponsors once again of today's webinar, which includes our First Nations and PBS Wisconsin Education. Once again, we'll be sharing the contact information for each of our panelists as well as our facilitator. So as you see on the screen right here, here's the contact information for each of our panelists that we'll be sharing with you in conjunction with our information that's shared around the PowerPoint slides, as well as the link to the video if you'd like to share with others as well. With that being said, we also definitely encourage you to be at future opportunities. One of the questions that we saw in the chat was talking about other opportunities where you can engage in dialogue with folks. So I definitely encourage you to, if you're interested, folks, to sign up for our next webinar, which will be held on Monday, October 3rd from 4 to 5:30, titled Honoring Indigenous Peoples, Teaching Culturally with PBS Wisconsin Resources. So we have an opportunity here from myself as the speaker, as well as other amazing colleagues at PBS Wisconsin Education. And so with that being said, folks, we look forward to seeing you at future opportunities and hope our paths do cross at certain points in times where you can be at other programming in addition to the amazing work that PBS Wisconsin Education does as well. And so with that being said, I'm gonna turn over to our colleagues at PBS Wisconsin to conclude our time here today.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you to our panel. I'm Michael Hartwell from PBS Wisconsin Education. We would love to hear from you. We would love for you to stay in touch with us at PBS. Here on the screen, you can see a couple ways to stay connected, sign up for our newsletters, and get all sorts of great updates of what we have to offer in terms of free, standards-aligned classroom media for you and your students. That media includes lots of great resources from the Wisconsin First Nations, speaking to issues that were discussed in today's webinar, and also plenty more in various content areas and across grade levels. We would love to see you at our webinar next Monday to discuss Indigenous Peoples Day, as David mentioned. And otherwise, check out our websites, check out our media collections. And lastly, again, before we sign off for the day, thank you again to our incredible panel for today's discussion. A big thank you, a big shout out to all three of our panelists, as well to our facilitator, David O'Connor. We hope you learned a lot. We hope you felt a lot. And most importantly, we hope that you spread the word and share this information with your students, with your fellow educators, and with everyone else that you know. Be well. Thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.